Welcome to Roghnu's Power BI training series. In this video, we're going to be working with DAX. So DAX stands for Data Analysis Expressions. And if you're used to working with Excel functions, then DAX is going to be a lot easier to you than someone who hasn't worked with Excel functions because there's actually a lot of similarities between them. That said, there are differences as well. One of the major things to keep in mind is that whereas in Excel you have cells, right? You have cells. Well, you don't have those cells in Power BI. So it's easy to just kind of click around in Excel in a cell and input a function that references another cell. Well, you can't so easily reference things in Power BI using DAX because we don't have cells, so there are no cell references. But I think that trips up a lot of people who are used to Excel and then they come into Power BI because what I've frequently seen is they go right into using what's called calculated columns. All right, so there's a difference between calculated columns and calculated measures, or DAX measures versus DAX columns. So a calculated column, like it sounds, is you're creating a new column in a table, much like you would in Excel. If you have a table in Excel and you want to create a new column in that table, you just input your formula and that formula gets generated for each row, right? It calculates that formula for each row, just iterates down. And so that's what a lot of people are used to. And they say, so they come into Power BI and they start creating a bunch of calculated columns. And let me give you an example of what that looks like. So here we're in the AP bill all table here. Let's say, okay, we have in here a total column. And let's see if we can find it. There's a lot of columns here. We don't necessarily need to find it. It's in here though. Oh, there. I think we found it. Okay, total due. So let's say, just for the sake of demonstration, I want to create a calculated column that takes the total due and multiplies it by 10%. Okay, so I'll right click the table and do new column. All right, so I'm going to give the column a name. We'll just call this demo column equals, and I'm going to start typing the total due. We'll see that it pops up here. Hit tab, times 0.1 for 10%, and hit enter. And we're going to see our new column right here. So it performs that calculation, and as you see, it just iterates through all the down the rows. Now, okay, that's nice and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that per se, but let's say this table has millions of rows, right? If I do a calculated column like this on a table with millions of rows, well, then we start running into problems, right? Especially if I'm creating multiple calculated columns, because whenever you do a calculated column, when the data gets refreshed, those calculated columns get refreshed with the data, right? So they get rerun with the data. And so if you have a lot of rows that have to be iterated over, that can slow down the performance. So it's best practice to go right into using measures. If you can't do something with a measure, or if for some reason you need to do a calculated column, it's best to go into the query editor and create a custom column. In a different video, I demonstrated how to work in the query editor. And so we saw how to do data transformations, including creating custom columns. So what we did here, creating this demo column, we can do the same thing in the query editor, right? And so it's best practice to get as close to the original data source as you can. So if I wanted to do this, I would do that there in the query editor, right? It doesn't mean I can't do it here. And if it's a small table, maybe it's not a problem to do that. But again, it's just best practice to go into the query editor. Or in this case, I could also create a measure essentially doing the same thing. I can use an iterator function, and we'll get into all of that over time here in this video. So that's just a quick introduction to the difference between a calculated column and a calculated measure. Measures do not take up memory. Okay, it's not going to increase the file size, whereas calculated columns will. All right, and measures are evaluated dynamically at query time based on filter context. And we'll get into this discussion of the different contexts that you work with. We won't go right into that. I don't want to go right into that because that can be a little confusing to understand. I want to begin by just looking at some existing measures, right? Just getting familiar and comfortable with measures and how they work, and get familiar with common functions that will be utilized in measures. So if we look here at AP bill amount, I'll click on that. Here, let me go out here. All right, AP bill amount, I'll click on that. And you see, here's my measure, AP bill amount equals sum, and here's the column, right, that it's summing, AP bill item amount from the AP bill all table. So that's a simple, basic measure, and typically you're going to have a lot of these in your data model. That's pretty much the first thing you do once you get your data loaded, is you start building out these basic measures that can be used in other measures. So sums, where you sum, numerical columns, and counts. Typically with counts, you're using count rows, where you're counting the rows in a table. And then you can use that in another measure, right? And then as that gets filtered, the row count will change. So sums and counts are very common basic measures that you will use in other measures. So if I, for example, go to AP bill amount due previous quarter, so if you're not used to DAX and you look at this may look a little daunting, but you'll find that you quickly get used to this. And I'm actually going to walk you through step by step what's going on here, just to get you familiar with it, and then it won't look so scary. So here's that base measure, right, that we just looked at, AP bill amount due, where it's just summing that column. All right, so that base measure is getting used in this measure. That's one of the beautiful things about DAX measures, is you can use measures and measures and measures. So starting at the top here, these vars, these are just variables. All right, so this means we're declaring a variable, we're giving it a name, in this case current quarter, equals to assign it something. In this case, we're just using two DAX functions, quarter and today. So today simply returns today's date, and that is nested within the quarter function. So this is going to return the quarter number, 1, 2, 3, or 4, of today's date. Okay, same concept with current year. This is going to return the year of today's date. All right, now we have the variable previous quarter. So here we're using if-then logic. So there's different scenarios we want to account for here. So if the current quarter equals 1, then 4, else current quarter minus 1. So obviously we're accounting for, well, let's say it's January, so the quarter is 1. Well, if we do 1 minus 1, we're going to get 0, which doesn't make sense. We want to return 4 for the previous quarter. So this if-then logic just takes that into consideration so that we get the right thing returned. Then we have previous year, again, the same thing. If the current quarter equals 1, then current year minus 1, else current year. Okay, and then the return, so anything after the return is what's going to be returned in the measure. So this is all just preliminary where we're creating variables that will get used in what follows after the return. Now here we are using the calculate function. Calculate is a very dynamic and versatile function, and you're going to see it in a lot of measures that exist in our report packages. So here we're calculating. What are we calculating? We're calculating the AP bill amount due, right? That base sum measure. And then after this comma, we're providing filters. So this allows us to do filtering. Here we're filtering to where the quarter num in the date table equals the previous quarter, and where the year in the date table equals the previous year. All right. So hopefully all that is understandable and makes more sense when we look at something large like this. Okay, so let's look at another measure now. And again, what I'm doing right now is I'm just going through a lot of different DAX measures that we have to expose you to DAX, to help you get familiar with it. Don't think you have to remember everything now. There's a lot involved in DAX, and it just takes time to get comfortable with it the more you write it. So right now I'm just exposing you to DAX, to the various functions and explaining those, and then we can go into more detail after that. So here we're looking at AP bill amount due current month. Again, we see the var and the return, so we're creating a variable first. Our variable we're calling calc, and we're using the calculation function. We have our base measure here, and then we have this new function we haven't seen yet, dates month to date. The MTD stands for month to date. So dates month to date. Then we pass in a date column here from our date or calendar table. Basically, the dates month to date returns a set of dates in the month up to the last date visible in the filter context. All right, so again, it returns a set of dates in the month up to the last date visible in the filter context. All right, so we're performing that, and then we're applying a filter after that, where year from the date table equals year of today. So today, at the time of this recording, it's 2026. It's the 12th of June. So if there's no other filter being applied to this, then this would look at AP bill amount due from June 1st to June 12th. All right, then we have our return, and we're applying, again, we see this if, we're doing this if logic, if then. Now notice this looks different than the other if we saw with regard to its layout, right? Before the if line was just straight across. Here it's vertical. That's okay. It doesn't matter. It's going to do the same thing. Often what you'll find is DAX is written in this manner. See, like broken out like this. See, I can technically do this. I can jumble all of this up together. So everything's jumbled up together, one line. It does the exact same thing. Nothing's going to break. But it's harder to read this than when it's broken out like this into separate lines. So a lot of people write it that way to make it easier to read. Write it in the way that's comfortable to you. Now, if I want to go to the next line, I can't hit enter because that's going to conclude the DAX measure. It's going to run. So what I do is I hold Shift Enter. All right, it goes to the next line. I can hit Tab. actually I want this 2 to go to the next line. There we go. Okay, and then just go here after the comma, shift, enter. So typically, a comma represents a break in the line is where you'd want to, or like a closing parentheses. So here, and then I'll just format it that way. So that's why this looks different here, but it's the exact same. So if is blank, so another new function here. So is blank is basically going to return a true or false. So if our calc variable is blank, then it will return true. And if it returns true, we want it to return 0. Else, calc. So if the calc variable is blank, return 0. Else, return the calculated value. All right, let's go to another measure here. AP bill amount due current quarter to date. So here we have our calculate function. Again, you're going to see this a lot. It's so versatile. We have our base measure, and now we have dates quarter to date. Same concept as the dates month to date, just using quarter to date. And then again, we have filtering that's being applied where we're looking at the year of today. Okay, let's take a look at another DAX measure here. So here we have PO total current quarter to date versus previous quarter to date. And it says icon here, so we're returning an icon using the unichar function. So here, this is all wrapped in the switch function. So the way to think about the switch function is think of it as a nested if function. So for example, if I go down here, so I could technically write this with if, true, false. So I went right, true, false here, but I'm gonna put in like this here, PO total current quarter to date versus previous quarter to date, or greater than previous quarter to date. So if that's true, so we'll just do this. If true, right, then return value. Else if, or technically in DAX would be if, so we would do another if true, return value. Then we could do more ifs, if true, return value. So you can see we could keep going, nesting ifs within ifs until we return our else, right? If all of those fail, the final value or thing that gets returned. Well, this is valid. We could do nested ifs like this to write this measure, but it's cluttered, right? It doesn't look very neat. It's not as easy to read. This, using the switch function, is much easier to read. So we could, instead of doing all these nested ifs, you can imagine if we had more things, more lines we wanted to evaluate here, right? Let's just put this here. See, imagine, so if we did nested ifs, we would have, if is all these ifs, which would just be very cluttered and not easy to read. So instead of doing nested ifs, use switch. All right, so let me get this back to the way it was. So let me explain how this is evaluated. So switch true, which basically means we're saying, okay, if this statement here is evaluated as true, then return this unichar value. If this returns false, then it goes to the next line, looks at this. If this returns true, it's gonna return this unichar value. If this also returns false, then it's going to go to our final value here, which in this case returns a blank. So switch is very valuable when you want to evaluate different statements and return something different for each of those statements. Now let's briefly consider the difference between row context and filter context. And we'll also look at an example of an iterator function that allows you to incorporate row context in a DAX measure. So when we talk about row context, we're basically talking about DAX evaluating one row at a time. This is automatically created in a calculated column, right? Which makes sense. And we saw that before. If I go to a table here and I, create a column here, that column that gets created is going to be in the row context. That measure is going to be evaluated row by row. It's going to iterate through the table. That's row context. But this row context can also be created inside iterator functions, which includes functions that are referred to as X functions. That includes SumX, AverageX, MinX, and MaxX. But it also includes functions like filter and add columns, among others. So row context basically allows you to reference columns from the current row directly. All right. And then the filter context is the entire set of filters applied when a calculation is performed. So filters can come from visuals, they can come from report pages, and they can come from DAX functions, such as the calculate function. So for example, what you see here on the screen, in this table here, the filters, right now, the only filter context for the values in here would be the location in the table, right? So for this cell here, the filter context is the location Australia. All right, but I can come over here into this filter pane where I added currency code, and I can filter this down to USD, and we see that filters the table. So now, so the currency code of USD is part of the filter context. I can hover over this table, and if I hover over this, I see that currency code is part of the filtering here. All right, and then I also have a slicer up here. Right now, a customer is not selected, but I can choose a customer here, AB square. And now if I hover over this table and hover over this icon again, I see that name, which is customer, is now part of this filter context. So that's the difference between row context and filter context. All right, let me go ahead and I'll just clear these out for the demonstration here. So we have three different columns here. This one is a calculated column that I calculated in one of the SO table, SO entry table, document entry. So in that column is calculated by summing the total and multiplying it by the quantity. So total times quantity. If I go to that table, total times quantity, I see values that are being returned here. All right, so I plug that in here, and then I'm doing something similar, but as you can tell, I'm not getting the right values. All right, so that is the sum function here. What I'm doing is I'm first summing the total column in the SO document entry. Then I'm multiplying that by the sum of the quantity column. And this is obviously not going to work. It's not going to produce the right values because we're summing all the totals and then summing all the quantities and then multiplying, when really what we need is to do an iteration over the rows. So we need to use an iterator function, in this case SumX. So if I click on SumX here, SumX function, so we see, so SumX, and then we have the table that is in view here that we're going to iterate over, and then we're performing our calculation. The total column multiplied by the quantity column. All right, and then as we see, we get the right values, the same as in this one. So again, as I mentioned earlier, it's best practice not to create calculated columns unless for some reason you absolutely have to. So if you're trying to if you want to create a calculated column, something like this, where you're taking a total value, multiplying by a quantity, for example, and you don't want to do a calculated column, well, you can create a measure using the SumX iterator function. But again, there's also average x, there's min x, max x, and so on. So there's a lot of functions out there that enable you to do all of these different types of calculations. Okay, so we covered a lot of DAX functions and measures. We explored quite a bit. You got a good look at the ways that DAX functions are utilized to create measures and calculated columns. You got a good idea of the structure of various calculations. Now, obviously, this is probably a video that you'll want to rewatch because DAX can be complex in some ways. The thing about DAX is it's easy to get started up and running. You think of your base measures like sum, average, min, max, stuff like that you can reuse in other measures. But DAX can also get really complex, really advanced. And so this is just a skill set that you'll continue to build the more you work with DAX. And to help you along the way, I want to draw your attention to DAX.guide. DAX.guide. So this is essentially an online dictionary of DAX functions. As you can see here along the left side, we have all the DAX functions. We can scroll down, but we also have them neatly organized by different categories or functions, like what they do. So if there's a particular aggregation you're trying to perform, well, you have your aggregation functions here, and you can scroll through these. You see all of the descriptions for each function. And if you find one that seems like the kind of function you need, say max, you can click into that. You have your definition or description. You have the syntax of the function, whether or not any of the parameters are optional, what the parameters do or what they are. You have the return, what the function returns. And then you get into additional remarks and examples, and these examples are very helpful, very, very helpful. So you just scroll through and just look at the examples and try to understand what they're doing. As you can see, there are comments provided to help you along the way. And then you see the output that they put in tables, so you can see the differences that get returned based on the inputs. And then if you find an example that looks like what you're trying to do, you can just copy that, paste that into your measure, and tweak it to fit your need. All right, so let's go back here. And again, we can also search. So if you have a specific function in mind, let's say switch. Switch is something we looked at before. We find the switch function. All right, so we have our description, the syntax of it. So you can go deeper into understanding switch and the various ways it can be used. Again, you have your examples down here, which shows different some different ways of using switch than we use it. Here, we did this true. Here you have A is greater than B or just A. So the thing about DAX is you want to play around with it, right? DAX is one of those fun things to play around with, and you discover things along the way, and you discover there's different ways that you can get the same value, right? You can write DAX in different ways, and some of those ways may be better than others. You'll build up proficiency in that the more you work in DAX. So I hope all this has been really helpful to you.
For more information on working with Roghnu and exploring how the data portal can help you get the most out of Sage Intacct alongside your other critical business data, scan the code on the screen or click in the link in the description.